Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Paymar, and you are listening to The Big Shift, the podcast that looks at the seismic changes our world and our country confront. Today, we're exploring a vital aspect of our society: news. Shockingly, more than 1 in 5 Americans now live in news deserts with very limited access to local news, according to a study by Northwestern University. 70 million people, think about this, who live in 200 counties don't have a newspaper. And more papers are shutting down. 2 newspapers a week are disappearing. In the past 2 years, 64 new digital state and local news sites went online, but that was about the same number that went out of business. To explore the critical issue of the lack of news and where we are heading without the news is Jaci Clement, the CEO and executive director of the Fair Media Council in New York. Jaci is an industry thought leader, a writer, speaker who submitted filings with the FCC and amicus briefs in media court cases that have influenced outcomes to protect the public interest. And she hosts her own podcast called Fast Chat. Jaci, welcome to The Big Shift. Glad you could find the time.
No, thank you, Jim. It's an honor to be here with you.
Jaci, we've seen kind of a free fall of the press in the last decade or so. I mentioned the news deserts, but beyond that, surviving newspapers have slashed their editorial staffs. Circulation has plunged, and print revenues have been rabid. Why aren't people reading papers anymore? And what is the impact on the public that lacks news coverage?
That's a big question. And in a nutshell, the quick answer is technology came along and changed the entire media landscape. But from there, once we break it down, it gets kind of interesting, because if you're of an older generation, you're used to reading a printed newspaper. And if that printed newspaper, either like a lot of local newspapers have, or if it moved to online only, they've lost that portion of their audience, when they move from print to online only. And then kind of, if you're in the middle group of Americans that you were tech savvy and you moved to online, you did it because waiting for tomorrow's newspaper to bring you yesterday's news, there wasn't enough time to do that. We wanted information right then and there. That also destroyed the actual journalism model along with it. That middle group is interesting. And then you have the younger group, which I would say are the younger millennials, the Gen Zs, and Generation Alphas, who have never read a newspaper. They've never been exposed to printed information.
Right.
They grew up online with the news following them. And one of the things that's really interesting about that group is they can't distinguish between local news and national news. They have no idea who their local news providers are.
You're so right.
It's just a crazy landscape right now.
About 20 years ago, newspaper revenues topped $50 billion. And today, the revenues have declined to $20 billion. Newsroom employment has dropped 60%, and 4 out of 5 on-staff photographers have lost their job. The quality of news suffers greatly with those kinds of cuts, and we've seen the size of newspapers shrink. Hardly any in-depth reporting anymore. Who's watching out for the public if not the journalists?
Well, that's the thing. These great big holes are being created where we know the stronger your local news is, the less, it's tied directly to less corruption, because you've got people keeping tabs on, where your tax dollars are going, what your government officials are up to, even just crime in the neighborhood. You want what we would call the boots on the ground. Your local reporters out there on the street talking to people. You want them going into Main Street businesses to find out what's really on people's minds. And that's really what's missing in today's media landscape. Circulation has dropped. Advertising has dropped, but the advertising model has changed a lot. So that's not, the lack of advertising in newspapers isn't simply because newspapers are doing a bad job or doing less of a job. I think there's a great misunderstanding there. It's advertising itself has changed also, and what people want from advertising. So that's been a challenge. But, overall, it's just the impact of not having the printed word where people can relate to their community, their local backyards, and then take it up a notch to their region and what's happening in their state capital, and then take it up a notch from there and what's happening in the country. That's missing right now. There's no way to bridge the gap between those steps.
Yeah, well, who's going down to the village hall and covering the weekly meeting, or who's going to the town meeting, and who's going to the congressional meetings? And we just don't know anymore, like you said. And you're so right when you made that point about the digital versus print. If I go on to the New York Times website at midnight, I've already read the news for the rest of the day. When I get the paper in the morning, I've already read everything.
Yeah. And, we've kind of grown to expect that. And part of us even wants the news before it's happened, right? Which is totally against all axioms of journalism.
Yeah.
But it's just become kind of the nature of the beast. But I think now we're finally at a point where journalists are sitting back, they're taking a deep breath and saying, okay, what we're doing isn't working. And that's not to say that there's not some good journalism happening out there. It's the good journalism is being hard to find because there's such a clutter of what I would call junk content going on out there. So it's like you have to sift through the garbage to get to the good stuff.
And then when you get to the news, you're not even sure if it is the news anymore. So many people are getting it off Facebook and Twitter. And unless you're going to a legitimate site from those platforms, you don't know what you're getting. And some people, they read these headlines or they'll read a short story and you don't know if it's true. They don't check it out. They don't double check it. And these platforms don't provide any services to really scrutinize whether the news is true or not.
No, and I think that was probably one of the greatest learning experience for technologists in that they don't understand the First Amendment whatsoever. They may serve as information vehicles, but they're not the ones who are creating the information. They're simply the delivery channel.
Right.
And it's been really hard for the public. And again, depending on where you are with your own technology skills, it becomes very hard to figure out where that information is actually being originated from, as opposed to who's simply distributing it. So I hear lots of people telling me they get their news from Twitter or from Facebook. And the reality is, well, Twitter and Facebook don't do news. So no. Don't.
No.
It's delivered to you that way.
They can provide links to the news. So if you read a story on Twitter and it gives you a link to the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Boston Globe or, some of the legitimate, the Times of London, whatever it might be, right, you know that you're getting some authority there.
Yes.
And a lot of times people, they just look at their Twitter feed and they go, oh, I know what's going on,
Right. And they have no idea that story didn't actually come from the New York Times or even a place that they even recognize.
Right.
I will say in that regard, the BBC does do a very good job about branding, so that when you do click the link, you're reading something from the BBC. And a lot of news organizations haven't caught on to that.
Well, there should be, in my view anyway, there should be some kind of enforcement, some kind of regulation. I know the FCC has no control over newspapers or Twitter or Facebook, but we've got to get back to some honesty and some integrity and some credibility here when it comes to the press. People are confounded. They don't know what's actually going on. They're not looking at the news stories very deeply, and they're not checking out sources. I've had people send me things and I go, wait a minute, this was published 10 years ago.
Yeah.
as if they just learned about it today, but it's actually a 10-year-old story.
Yeah. And you bring up a couple great points, actually. One of which is, the FCC throughout history has been viewed as sort of this backwater agency where you throw the old cable guys who have nothing else to do and, some political appointees. The reality is the world we live in now, the FCC should be front and center and really getting rid of its old playbook that no longer relates to anything. So much of what they're doing is just sticking square pegs in round holes at this point. and really creating new rules for, like you said, things have to have some sort of accountability. The public needs help to figure out what's real, what's not, and you need some guidelines. And you do need regulation, no matter how you slice it. We've gone through decades now of less and less regulation, and the argument has always been by the news outlets that because of the regulations, we're too weak. But yet we've continued weakened the regulations. We got rid of the fairness doctrine. We got rid of the cross ownership ban. The Telecommunications Act of 96 weakened things even more to allow more consolidation. Every step they've made along the way to make things easier for the media has only resulted in a weaker media. At some point, you have to say, okay, let's stop doing what we're doing and reassess, and let's put some rules in place that make sense.
We have to have some guardrails. We just have to.
Yeah, you do.
We used to, like you said, you named the fairness doctrine and on down the line. We have to have some guardrails. Otherwise, the First Amendment is kind of meaningless. I mean, freedom of speech, I mean, you can't yell fire in a theater, right?
That's what people conveniently forget. When they make it the argument that we have freedom of speech and they think it means you can say anything. That's not what it means. You're responsible for that which you say.
Another point that you made as you were speaking was the ownership of media today is all big corporations. And the biggest newspaper chains, Gannett Lee, Tribune, McClatchy, Alden, Hearst, they control the fate of many of the nation's surviving newspapers. And most of these chains are owned by hedge funds and private equity groups. And those financial groups, they sell the newspapers for profit. And the papers that don't make money, what do? They shut them down if they can't find a buyer. How did it come to be that there's not this kind of local ownership? I remember growing up, and obviously I'm dating myself now, but it seemed like every paper was locally owned and the publishers had a stake in their own communities. That's not the case anymore.
No, it's not. And that lack of local ownership really plays into just, from my view, a lack of soul and a lack of a conscience within the local papers that you're talking about, because they were tied into the community and they were that tapestry that brought the community together and held it together. So, I mean, what's happened is consolidation has been the rage for the past couple of decades, but I think we're finally at a point where they're saying, you know what, I'm no longer getting the profit margins I thought I would get the rationale was if I own one newspaper and I buy the newspaper next door to it, well, now I can own twice as much and get away with having half the staff, because why do I need two people to cover business? That one person can cover business.
Exactly. And the same thing's going on in television, duopolies in a lot of the smaller markets where one station buys up another station and they just use the same news service. They have the same sales department. We've lost, even in the TV medium, the number of people out there covering news on the streets.
Yeah. And also what's factoring into this is the more the consolidation is, the less they're looking at. They want to have less expenses, put it that way.
Well, that's
they want to spend less in terms of overhead, and your biggest overhead when it comes to news is people.
Yep.
So what they tend to do is get rid of the experienced reporters, because they're the ones that are paid more, and bring in the younger staff. And the younger staff don't necessarily know the communities. They don't have the institutional knowledge. They don't have the journalism experience to make a lot of the decisions that they need to make on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not mentored by the older staff. So they're never actually going to bridge that gap.
And they make a lot of mistakes. And there are a lot of inaccuracies, and there's a lot of lost information because they don't know what questions to ask. It took me a long time. I had to go from market to market to market to market to end up in New York.
Right.
Now today, if you come from the neighborhood and they can get you cheap, they hire you.
Exactly. The standards are all gone, and it to be. The hallmark of news has always been local, because local is where reporters learn how to find expert sources and weed out the people that want to be in the news. They learned how to check fact, and they learned what kind of impact their stories had.
Right.
So without the kind of structure that we used to have, which is, you work local then you jump to national, or
Mm-hmm.
regional, and then you go to national. That system is now broken. So you're getting a lot of people at the national level now that don't have the background that old-time reporters had in terms of fact checking and being able to rely on reliable sources for information.
And another point that I have heard you speak about is this lack of competitiveness. When one newspaper buys out another newspaper and then merges the staff, or the same holds true for a television station, you lose the competitive nature of news. When I went out on the street in New York, you were competing against 6 other stations out there.
Right.
And you fought and scrapped, and you tried to get the best story you could so you could beat the competitor, because you knew your bosses were back there watching every TV station on monitors. And if you didn't have that information, you were in trouble.
Right. Yeah. No, and I don't think reporters get into trouble like they need to with their editors anymore.
Yeah. On the flip side, and you mentioned this, the reading of digital newspapers has seen a huge increase. The New York Times has nearly 49 million unique visitors worldwide. The Washington Post, 26 million. I mean, those are really big numbers. And you read it on your smartphone or your computer or your tablet, but people are paying advertising and subscription fees to read the New York Times and the Post. So are things really so bad for the major players and the editorial staffs?
That's an interesting question, because when you look at the nationals, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, they're in a completely different ballpark than your local news media, which is your local newspapers that have maybe a 3,000 or a 15,000 readership.
Mm-hmm.
You can't compare them to the New York Times, which has such a larger readership that if the New York Times takes 3% of its readers and converts them to digital subscribers, that's a pretty healthy number.
Yeah, they're doing well.
Okay. But if I'm running a local weekly paper with 3,000 subscribers and I can convert 3%, which is a healthy number, I'm still not paying the bills.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, the industry gets itself into trouble by saying the New York Times is doing it, so I can do it too.
Yeah, but the New York Times is a kind of a monolithic institution and has worldwide reach. And
yeah, that's the point they're overlooking.
Yeah. Newspapers, though, they're getting into different lines of revenue. For example, my mother-in-law, she gets a New York Times subscription just for recipes.
Yeah.
Some people get them for crossword puzzles. So they're making money in a lot of different ways. And they're also getting into the television business. Scripps, for example, which was a major newspaper company, is now a major television operator offering a news channel. Newsday, which we're well aware of, a local newspaper here on Long Island, now has a TV service. I'm wondering if that is the wave of the future.
I think so. And I think part of it, actually, it's coming to fruition now, but I think the death of BuzzFeed News kind of plays into this, and we'll see more of a push to get into television or to streaming, where in the past people were looking strictly to digital only. Because I think people are realizing that you're not getting the audience that you thought you would get online. The tech giants make it very difficult for people to find you. The techs want the newspaper publishers to put their stuff on Facebook or on Twitter.
Right.
They don't want to drive the traffic directly to your website. So I think that's playing into part of it. And another issue, though, Jim, is there's such a reliance on subscription now as a main driver of revenue. And subscription is hard because people play games with that. So like you do with Netflix, I'll subscribe for 1 month and I'll binge watch everything. And then I'll cancel my subscription next month, right?
Yep.
And then I go somewhere else. So there's no brand loyalty with it. So that's part of the issue of what the news industry is grappling with. They got rid of the brand loyalty.
And you brought up a good point, the streaming issue. Last year, for the first time, viewers spent more time streaming programming than they did watching broadcast TV, marking a huge shift in viewer preference. And you've got to think that this is just going to continue. And all of the networks now, all of the TV news networks, they're all broadcasting their newscasts on streaming. I can watch, if I want to watch where my kids live out in the Bay Area, I can turn on KGO, KPIX, KRON, KNTV, and watch those stations online. They're all streaming.
Yeah, which is actually a huge benefit to people now. So that is one of the good things that has come out of the digital age. But I will tell you, yeah, now they actually call, like, if you want to watch the news at 5 o'clock, they have a term for that now. It's called appointment viewing. Like, you have to make an appointment to watch the news.
Yeah.
People are so out of, sync with doing that. We expect everything on demand.
Well, I DVR almost all of my news programming, and I watch it when I want to watch it, and I eliminate the commercials doing that. But I don't know if how that fits into the revenue stream. If I'm not watching the commercials, of course, if I'm watching the program, they're measuring the overall reach of the program itself. So I don't know how that all factors in. We need a sales executive to talk about that.
It is interesting, though, that they're giving their subscribers an incentive not to look at the ads.
Right.
They're offering you a cheaper subscription, or rather a subscription that's just a few dollars more that allows you to bypass ads. Where ads historically were where most of the money came from to support the news organization.
That's right. Listen, besides the news deserts that we talked about in the very beginning, there are a great number of hyper local news sources now, like Patch, an online service. It was started by AOL years ago, and they sold it to an investment firm. And there are also hundreds of community newspapers, and new digital platforms are coming online. Is this an area where journalism can grow and thrive?
It can, but it's very difficult. One, it's difficult because news is a very labor-intensive type of endeavor. You can't run the same news every day.
Right.
Where if you made widgets for a living, you could sell tomorrow. Tomorrow you could sell the same widgets you made today.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that with news. So the labor intensity tends to burn out people who try startups. And, even though they say it's nearly free to set up these organizations, you need the manpower.
Right.
You need the dedication. You need the people who are out there. And you need people selling ad spots or whatever it is you want to call them.
Mm-hmm.
So, you need a strong business sense. I mean, I think that's one of the big parts of the story that people are overlooking, that your local news outlets are owned by small business owners. Often they're family-owned businesses, and they're grappling with technology and how fast technology is changing. And they're not necessarily the best equipped. So it's really news entrepreneurs that we need. We need people with vision. We're not seeing a lot of visionaries right now because everybody's focused on short-term gains.
Well, that's the name of the game, and that's why private equity and the hedge funds are into this. It's all about dollars and cents. It's not about the communities. They don't even know anything about the communities for most part. Jaci, there are some 1,700 licensed TV stations in America, and many have newscasts. And there are also local cable news channels in a lot of markets. But with streaming and fast channels, which are free ad-supported television stations, which are emerging. Fast channels, they're called. Is this going to eat into the audience of the local stations and hurt them in their ability to cover news?
Well, there's two schools of thought on that. One is you would think it would cannibalize their audiences, right?
Yeah.
But the other school of thought is sort of like the same philosophy of, why just put a single store in an area where I can build a whole mall? Won't the mall attract more people? So if people that tend to gravitate toward news tend to gravitate toward more than one thing in the news. So you could argue the more news that's out there, you will attract people who have a serious vested interest in your product.
Right.
And more news junkies, basically.
Yeah, but what doesn't make sense to me, Jaci, as a recent NAB analysis, National Association of Broadcasters analysis of Nielsen data shows that America's broadcasters are delivering more local news than ever.
Yeah.
The number of local news telecasts airing in November 2021 across the country increased by some like 35% over the last 10 years. Today, there are more than 154,000 local newscasts compared to 114,000 in 2011. That's a huge increase. But is the news quality improving along with the number of broadcasts, or are we just seeing a lot of repetition? Take the one program that you produce, put a different anchor team in front of it, and move some of the stories around. We're seeing a lot more newscasts, but are we seeing more news and in-depth news?
I would argue on the day-to-day, you're seeing a lot of repetition,
Mm-hmm.
but where the real strength in expanding the hours of newscast comes in. I mean, I remember when your local newscast used to be 5 o'clock, then they started at 6 o'clock, then they added a 4 o'clock, then they added a 12 noon, and then they expanded the morning. So there are a lot more of hours being devoted to television news.
Right.
But what we know is when there's a major event, that's when the interest in news
spikes.
Yeah. And when they have the programming in place already, now they can break in with breaking news and keep you up to date on what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So in times like that, that's where you really see the strength of being able to run just the amount of man hours and the programming. But on the day-to-day, yeah, you see a lot of repetition, or you see a lot of, let's just give you a quick update to the story that we ran at 12 noon. It's not all new news that you're seeing.
We spoke about news deserts in relationship to newspapers, but what about suburban communities in huge TV markets? On Long Island, for example, outside New York City, 3 million people live here. There's one TV station, a PBS station dedicated to the region. There's a cable news channel. Same holds true for New Jersey, a state of 10 million people, but no dedicated TV station except a PBS station. So Jersey gets New York and Philadelphia coverage for the most part. Mm-hmm. Orange County, California, 3 million people, but their coverage is dependent on Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. The huge suburban areas really seem to be getting the short end of the stick. I know that these areas are all covered by bureaus from the big cities, but it seems to me, from what I watch, they're pretty underserved, heavily populated areas. They may get one or two stories on a given newscast. That's not great coverage.
It gets very complicated when you get into these particular areas. So on Long Island, yeah, we have the PBS station. We used to have another station, which was ION.
Yes.
Which we lost. We do have TV 55, which is now part of the CBS duopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing there, though, is CBS does more local programming on it than when it used to be locally owned.
Local programming or local news?
Both. So okay. But let me add this caveat, though. That's easy to do because when it was locally owned, it only did a half-hour news program once a day. And the rest was all syndicated programming. So it's easy to increase that number.
So listen, I don't want to forget radio because massive numbers of people are commuting. I think more people are commuting by car than by rail now because of the pandemic and because of fears of crime, etc. And the big markets too are dominated by these huge 50,000 watt stations, and the smaller stations in the suburbs outside of those markets, they have to really struggle to reach listeners because they have low powered transmitters. Is streaming going to save these smaller stations where we've also seen a massive cutback in news coverage?
Well, Jim, the reality is, the local radio stations gave up doing news a long time ago when those regulations changed. So I can tell you, on Long Island, we have 19 commercial stations. So that doesn't include your PBS stations, doesn't include your college stations.
Mm-hmm.
Of the 19 radio stations we have, one of them does some local news programming.
And not much.
Yeah, not much. And none of the others do.
Mm-hmm.
It's all music.
I mean, I don't know how you get around that. Although the streaming element does give you the potential, especially, as new cars get produced and you can listen to radio online rather than AM, FM. maybe that's the future. Maybe there's growth and revenues to be made there. One other thing I'd like to touch base on is the chat bots, the AI chat bots that we're hearing so much about, like Chat GPT, Bard, and Bing.
Yeah.
They actually have the ability to write stories, and they are nowhere near perfect. The New York Times did an analysis the other day, a lot of inaccuracies when they asked the bots to write a story. They got a lot of facts wrong, and you and I both read that same story. A friend of mine who I worked with in TV had me look into a story about him on a chat bot, and it said that he died in 1999.
Oh, that's not good.
Now, he's very much alive, but as these chatbots become more sophisticated, there's a fear that they could replace journalists. And I'm just wondering, if they don't get it right now, why are they going to get it right in the future? They're just kind of scraping the internet for news and putting it together as a story. How do we know it's right?
It's emerging issue is what I want to say about that. But what's interesting, you can make the same argument that the human-made news right now isn't doing a great job with getting the facts right. We've seen a huge shift with factual related reporting not being done on the national level.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what's national news now is actually opinion. They've got away from local, and anytime they get the facts wrong, they blame local news for not getting the facts right.
Yep.
So they've completely divorced themselves. So it's kind of interesting, that dynamic that's going on right now. But the other thing with AI in general is, news outlets have already been using AI for years now. They've used it for weather.
Right.
Sports reporting. They use it for, the idea of the low-hanging fruit of maybe
basic information, basic things that are factual, like the temperatures, like sports scores.
Yes, exactly. So the bigger picture of whether or not it would ever actually be able to create a news story on its own, that's not the intent. But who knows how that will evolve? I mean, I'm sure there are outlets out there that would love to get rid of all their overhead and just let technology, roll out these stories. But I can tell you, talking to technologists, when they come up with these ideas, their intent is to serve the public, mm-hmm. and they don't see where it can go wrong. And it's kind of funny. Like, I often like to equate things happening in news to other things happening in life, because people often will say, I don't understand news, and kind of tune out because of that. But one of the things technologists are working on right now is the idea that in the future, we will each have our own doctor devoted to us for our own health care.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, but what that doctor will be is not a person. It'll be an avatar. Okay.
That's
so
right.
Now you could kind of relate to everything that could go wrong in that situation, right?
Yeah.
So you could see the same thing applies with news and media.
Well, ending on a good positive note, all of the stuff that's going on with private equity buying up stations and shutting down stations and shutting down newspapers. At the same time, television news, broadcast news, locally done, ranks as the most trusted news source compared to any other media. Now, that's certainly a positive aspect of our news universe today.
Oh, definitely. And the fact that local has always been the most trustworthy, that's what you bank on. And that's what you look to for the future. So once you get past all of the consolidation, it'll swing back to things breaking up and going back to more local owners and things of that sort. It's just a matter of time. And I think eventually, once they work it out and they understand how to use technology better, you'll actually see stronger reporting in the long run. But right now, it's like we're living through the trial and error phase. And the problem with that is the public's right to know.
Right.
Is falling by the wayside.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we turn it around because this is not the journalistic world I grew up in, and
no, and that's why they need you, Jim. They need you to remind them how it used to be done.
Well, I hope we're doing that right now, Jaci. And we spend a lot of time talking about a lot more issues, but we are out of time. But we'll revisit this critical issue in the future as it seems to be becoming a more serious problem by the day. Thank you so much for taking time with us today, Jaci.
Oh, happy to. Take good care.
Okay, well, that was Jaci Clement, the CEO and Executive Director of the Fair Media Council, an industry thought leader on the media located in New York. I'm Jim Paymar, and you've been listening to The Big Shift, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening today, and stay tuned for the next episode of The Big Shift, coming soon.